Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. This is actually the best turnout I've had in all the places I've gone so far. It's nice to see that this is one place where the myth surrounding Ronald Reagan has not caught on so heavily. This is Portland. I think, you know, a lot of people around the country I've talked to, even people who are progressive, that they have a sort of a sense that Ronald Reagan is someone that they didn't really care for, but they don't have a good sense of the degree to which his legacy and his policies have had such a major impact on the country. There's been Gallup polls that have shown that Ronald Reagan is the most popular former president, which is really kind of astounding. More popular than Lincoln or Washington or Kennedy, and I think a big part of the reason is because the media and the publishing industry has done a terrible job at informing people about the implications of Reagan's policies, and that's kind of what I've tried to do in this book, to strip away a little bit of that myth. I'm going to read a couple passages from the book, and after that I'd be glad to take any questions from anyone. This first passage is from the introduction of the book, which lays out a pretty good overview of what the book is about. This book is, I guess I should put my glasses on, that would help a little. This book is born of annoyance, a great bewilderment over the myth that continues to surround the presidency of Ronald Reagan. It gives voice to a vast swath of psychically disenfranchised Americans, millions of them, lumped most thickly in the urban areas on either coast, who never understood Reagan's appeal. For more than 2 decades, they have stood by puzzled as this Hollywood actor and shill for General Electric, this obvious enemy of the common people he claimed to represent, this empty suit who believed in flying saucers and allowed an astrologer to guide his presidential scheduling, held sway over the American imagination. Evidence is amassing to support their view. The bitter legacy of Reaganism, the subprime mortgage scandal, the near collapse of the financial system, widening income inequality, the emergence of lockdown America, the obscene inflation of CEO compensation, the end of locally owned media, market crashes, blackouts, drug company scandals, rampant greed and materialism is all around us. As D.H. Lawrence once wrote in another context, the cataclysm has happened. We are among the ruins. But the controversy that once surrounded Reagan seems to have been banished from our public discourse. It is not that there is no public indignation over the state of our democracy. Americans are in wide agreement that the country has gone horribly off course, that Washington is now bought and paid for by corporations and is making little effort to solve the nation's most vexing problems. The great conundrum is this: none of these unmistakable harbingers of American decline is being laid where it belongs, at the door of Ronald Reagan. In the 2 decades that have passed since Reagan left office, no non-academic book has appeared making the case that his policies were destructive for America, even though that view is commonly held among members of the left liberal intelligentsia. We have just finished a presidential campaign season marked by an unseemly competition among Republican aspirants to wrap themselves in the Reagan mantle. Quote, "I am a conservative Republican and I will remain so in the school of Ronald Reagan," proclaimed John McCain. Quote, "I took the same exact path Ronald Reagan took," insisted Mike Huckabee. In a Time magazine cover story headlined, "What Would Ronnie Do?" and Why the Republican Candidates Need to Reclaim the Reagan Legacy, political correspondent Karen Tumulty wrote admiringly that the former president, quote, "embodied the idea that progress comes from going up against the status quo." The disconnect between the Reagan of myth and the Reagan of reality has been palpable in the media for years. Rarely in the history of the democratic world has a press corps been so blind to a leader's faults, so gullible in the face of a concerted effort by a small band of zealots to burnish an otherwise lusterless image. The so-called liberal media failed to utter a peep of protest in 2003 when Esquire magazine named Reagan the greatest living American. This abjuring of all standards of even-handedness by the media could not help but have a profound impact on public opinion. It explains how a 2001 poll by the Gallup organization could find that Americans rate Reagan as the most popular former president, ahead of Kennedy, Lincoln, and Washington. His name adorns public landmarks across the country. the former Washington National Airport, any number of freeways, a medical center in Los Angeles, a Navy aircraft carrier, countless schools and office buildings, and a peak in New Hampshire's famous presidential mountain range. A group called the Ronald Reagan Legacy Project has a goal of pinning his name to a landmark in every one of the nation's 3,067 counties, including a monument to rival the Lincoln Memorial on the Mall in Washington. The apotheosis of Ronald Reagan was never more abject than in the coverage of his funeral. In death, as in the last years of his life, Reagan was revered in the media as a great patriot whose love of country and undying faith in American exceptionalism, the shining city on a hill, were his defining traits. He was lionized for his instinctive identification with the common man and for espousing the traditional values that had once been the backbone of the nation. He was hailed for an infectious optimism that restored the nation's faith in itself and put us on a path to the two longest spurts of economic growth in American history. The scant criticism of his domestic policies, almost none of it found in the electronic media, followed the same well-worn threads. His tax cuts and military buildup led to huge budget deficits. His administration was rife with ethical violations. His cuts in social welfare programs were seen by some as mean-spirited. The script could not have been more adoring if it was written by Nancy Reagan herself, but it was also stunning in its myopia. For Ronald Reagan, when the layers of myth are peeled away, was arguably the least patriotic president in American history. He laid the foundation for a new global economic order in which nationhood would gradually become meaningless. He enacted policies that helped wipe out the high-paying jobs for the working class that were the real backbone of the country. This supposed guardian of traditional values was the architect of wrenching social change that swept across the country in the 1980s, the emergence of an eerie, over-commercialized, postmodern America that has left so much of the population, the populace, psychically adrift. Reagan propelled the transition to hyper-capitalism, an epoch in which the forces of self-interest and profit seek to make a final rout of traditional human values. His legacy, mergers, deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, privatization, globalization, helped weaken the family and eradicate small-town life and the sense of community. Not only the inner-city poor, but working-class and middle-class Americans in small towns across the country were the losers in the post-Reagan era. Because of deregulation, trucking concerns, bus companies, and airlines have eliminated much of their service to small rural communities, leaving them isolated and economically depressed in a society ever dominated by the great population centers on either coast. Because of corporate consolidation, businesses are no longer owned locally and Main Street is gone. Companies made over many times by mergers and forced to tailor every decision to stock market prices have little loyalty to communities or people. Commerce becomes alien, unreliable, globalized. Plants are closed and companies are downsized, families uprooted, communities left without anchors. Reagan blithely ushered in an age of impermanence. It is remarkable that Reagan took none of the blame for the corporate scandals that marred the last years of the American century and ushered in the millennium, since they were largely of his making. Without his tax, regulatory, and antitrust policies, there would have been no savings and loan bailout, no frenzy of mergers in the 1980s and 1990s, no unseemly scramble for overnight fortunes by arbitrageurs and raiders, no destructive obsession with quarterly earnings at the expense of long-term investment, no wholesale abandonment of ethics on the part of corporate executives, nor would have there been an Enron or a subprime mortgage crisis, which sent shockwaves through the global financial system and placed the country on the brink of its worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. The ultimate ramifications of the crisis are still not clear as of this writing. The contagion of free market purism has infected almost every sector of American life. It was hardly a surprise that so little of Reagan's real legacy was found in the journalism that followed his death. The very simplicity of the image the public took away from his funeral, that of a mythical Reagan riding off into the sunset of the country he loved, was itself a result of commercial values invading our most important institutions. The same government policies that fueled corporate mergers in other sectors propelled the increasing concentration of the media, which has resulted in a shallow and homogeneous presentation of the news that runs no risk of offending advertisers. In the days following Reagan's death, the media showed little interest in the minutiae of his presidency, dwelling instead on the Gipper's beatific smile, his sunny optimism, his love affair with Nancy, the pageantry of the funeral, anything but his real effect on the world. Typical moment was the Dateline NBC segment on Reagan's legacy, in which correspondent John Hockenberry reported that in the late 1970s, America's torpor and self-doubt were swept away when, quote, Reagan rode in from the West. Hockenberry gushed on with superlatives. Reagan was larger than life, had enduring popularity, was a legend, stuck to his guns, had a personal touch. His achievements matched his soaring rhetoric. It would take more than a recession or James Bond adventure run amok like the Iran-Contra scandal to derail this president. Hockenberry and his guests spoke 114 sentences during the segment, only 2 of them containing criticism of Reagan's policies, and even those criticisms were dismissed in the same breath. Hockenberry said Reagan's policies, quote, inflamed critics who claimed he did not grasp the complexity and contradictions of his own positions. But Reagan saw no contradictions. His feel for simplicity came from what seemed to be a basic sense of right and wrong, good and evil, and an old-fashioned ideal. It cannot be disputed that there are legions of Reagan critics across the country, but why are they never seen on television or quoted in the media? Why is this dissenting view of Reagan's heroism never in the public eye? When CBS announced plans in 2003 to air The Reagans, a TV movie that presented Ron and Nancy in an unflattering light, there was such an outcry among Republicans, including a threatened advertising boycott, that the network canceled the showing and turned it over to Showtime, a cable network that had a fraction of the CBS audience. Television critics were quick to point out that it was unheard of for a network to pull the plug on a TV movie simply because of nitpicking over its accuracy. When it comes to media assessments of Ronald Reagan's presidency, the usual standards seem not to apply. Now I'm going to read a brief section from a chapter that is entitled The Effluvia of Commerce. This deals with the way in which Reaganism has empowered corporations and infused commercial values into so much of our society. Ronald Reagan completed the mission that his millionaire backers laid out for him all those years ago in California, the infusion of commercial values into virtually every sphere of American life. Big corporations now have a sway over our culture that would have appalled Adam Smith or Calvin Coolidge, perhaps even Ronald Reagan himself, were he alive and capable of a lucidity that frequently eluded him. The effluvia of commerce greet us everywhere we turn. Corporate logos and advertisements bellow at us through our televisions and computers, over our telephone lines, in the piles of junk mail on our doorsteps, in the classroom, in the textbook, on the scoreboard, in the names given to our public arenas, in the sponsorship of cultural events, in line at the post office and the supermarket, in elevators, at gas pumps, in the doctor's waiting room, on the jetliner, in the museum cafeteria, on the labels of our clothing, in the very ringing in our ears as we lie in bed at night. The huge corporate amalgams that have emerged from the frenzy of mergers since the early 1980s are now very much our masters. They are the arbiters of our taste and leisure, our relationships, even our thoughts. Large corporations figured out long ago that their growth depended not only on the manufacture of goods and services, but also on the manufacture of desire. Few were as honest as Charles Kettering, director of General Motors Research Lab in the 1920s, who called it the organized creation of dissatisfaction. Since Kettering's time, the creation of dissatisfaction has made many advances. With the explosion of information and the proliferation of media, commercial messages are constantly bombarding our senses, pulsating like strobe lights in our consciousness. Ronald Reagan, the great enabler, ushered in a disturbing new order by clearing away barriers to the final conquering of the human soul by the corporation. John Kenneth Galbraith, in his influential 1952 book, American Capitalism, referred to the labor movement and government as, quote, countervailing powers that prevented big business and commercial values from running roughshod over the nation. He could easily have listed ethics or community values as another countervailing power. Before the late 1970s, school boards would never have let corporations advertise on video monitors in our classrooms, and never could there have been a publicly owned arena named Tommy Hilfiger at Joan Beach Theater. A company called Space Marketing would not have had the audacity to float a serious proposal for a mile-wide billboard orbiting above the Earth's atmosphere. It would have violated accepted standards of civility. Ronald Reagan not only stripped away government and helped decimate the labor movement, He also contributed mightily to the erosion of community standards. At the hands of Reagan and his acolytes, barriers that once shielded venerable cultural and civic institutions from commercialism have crumbled as dramatically as the Berlin Wall. Corporate hucksterism now seeps into the classroom, the pulpit, the medical clinic, the non-profit sector, amateur athletics, jurisprudence, even the naming of important cultural landmarks. Some of the consequences of Reaganism have reached the level of absurdity. There has been an explosion of school-based marketing since the Reagan years. School children are confronted with commercial messages in their cafeterias, school assemblies, athletic facilities, and curricula. Corporations sponsor school stadiums, gymnasiums, education programs, even entire school buildings. And their influence on the school day and educational programming is growing every year. A generation ago, only a science fiction writer could have imagined Jared Fogle, the mascot of the Subway fast food chain, invited into schools to lecture children on obesity. His secret to losing weight, a diet limited to 2 Subway sandwiches a day. Or children learning about nutrition from curricular materials supplied by Hershey's Chocolate and McDonald's. Or classroom lessons on the Alaska oil spill sponsored by Exxon. Or a Procter & Gamble environmental curriculum that describes disposable diapers as good for the earth. When a Georgia school hosted a Coke Appreciation Day, a student who wore a Pepsi t-shirt was suspended until his parents complained. It sounds like Brave New World, but this is not some horrid futuristic vision. This is American public education today. It goes on from there to talk a little bit exactly how the Reagan administration brought this about, but I'm just going to skip to one more section. Reagan was not calibrating his policies on the arc of public opinion. From the time of the Gilded Age, Americans have had a healthy suspicion of big business, and polls in the 1970s and 1980s showed that distrust intensifying. Professors Thomas Ferguson and Joel Rogers, in an exhaustive review of polling data published in the Atlantic Monthly in the mid-1980s, reported that, quote, public skepticism toward business and support for government regulation of it actually increased on several dimensions during the 1970s. They found that from 1969 to 1979, the percentage of Americans who believed that there was, quote, too much power concentrated in the hands of a few large companies for the good of the nation increased from 61 to 79%, and that the share of those thinking that business was, quote, making too much profit went from 38 to 51%. Perhaps most surprising, from 1971 to 1979, the percentage who believed that, quote, government should put limits on the profits companies can make sharply increased from 33 to 60%. Other polls found that Americans had grown disenchanted with materialism in our consumer society. One such survey, conducted by Chivas Regal and released just before Reagan left office, found that, quote, 3/4 of the working public would like to see a return to a simpler society with less emphasis on material wealth. But Reagan acted as if the 1980 election, in which he gained only 50.7% of the ballots cast in the lowest voter turnout in 32 years, gave him a mandate to grant big business an unprecedented entree into the lives of Americans. It was not just the tax cuts and deregulation that gave corporations new power. The administration adopted a series of policies that received little attention at the time but served the express purpose of giving corporate America a much larger sway over our culture. At the same time, he gave his imprimatur to the sweeping away of traditions that had once served as a check on the behavior of corporate executives, Hollywood production companies, music labels, publishing houses, architects, developers, rock stars, and other cultural leaders, in an unspoken social contract that kept them from plunging headfirst into crass commercialism. The ethos of Reaganism contributed mightily to what thinking people find so distasteful about modern America: the explosion of advertising, the rise of infomercials, product placement in films, the takeover of healthcare by for-profit HMOs, the commercialization of schools, the slow creep of advertising into public broadcasting, the selling of naming rights for public landmarks, and many other corporate encroachments on the public and nonprofit sectors. In the post-Reagan era, we have become a culture that worships business. The number of financial publications has exploded in the last 2 decades, while those devoted to culture and politics have struggled to survive. Even while steeped in scandal, corporate CEOs are treated like rock stars, their autobiographies topping the bestseller lists, and their compensation soaring into the stratosphere, whether or not they perform for their companies. Bold commercialism has even affected people who were once heroes of the counterculture. Musicians and artists have forged alliances with corporations that would have seemed unimaginable in the pre-Reagan era. Artists ranging from Eric Clapton and David Bowie to Tina Turner and Ray Charles performed for Pepsi commercials in the 1980s. The Rolling Stones agreed to the first corporate-sponsored rock tour in 1997 with Mick Jagger and Sheryl Crow, the opening act, appearing on stage with clothes from Tommy Hilfiger's new, quote, rock and roll collection. For the supposed bad boys of rock, whose 1960s hit Satisfaction satirized conspicuous consumption, it was an abject bow to corporate greed. The new empowerment of corporations has cost us huge chunks of our lives. Americans now work more hours on average than our counterparts in any other developed nation for reasons closely linked to the Reagan Revolution, the stagnation of middle-class wages and the insecurity of corporate employment. In a world where the next round of corporate downsizing is always just around the corner, as CEOs seek to impress Wall Street with their ruthlessness, it becomes a matter of survival for employees to stay at their desks as long as they're co-workers. When we are not working, we are shopping, drawn by the vastly expanded forms of credit engendered by the post-Reagan deregulation of the financial sector. But woe to those who make too much use of the credit dangled before us by deregulated financial institutions. In the final indignity for this new generation of debt junkies, President George W. Bush signed legislation in 2005 that weakened citizens' ability to clear their debts through bankruptcy, a blatant giveaway to banks and credit card companies. Those noxious elements of contemporary American culture have no popular constituency. They were slid past Americans distracted by wedge issues like race, welfare, crime, and abortion. They are very much part of the Reaganites' vision for the future. Most were stated goals of Reagan's administration, while others were inevitable consequences ignored by corporate leaders hungry for more profit. As a case in point, the Reagan administration, as will be shown below, took very purposeful steps to eliminate fee-for-service in medicine and place the nation's health care in the hands of for-profit HMOs. Fast forward to 2006, and 10 hospitals in the Los Angeles area are under criminal investigation for discharging ailing homeless people onto the streets in violation of the law, a practice that officials say is happening throughout the country. In one case, Bellflower Hospital, part of Kaiser Permanente, the nation's largest HMO, was charged with dumping a gravely ill and demented 63-year-old woman into a crime-ridden area of Skid Row in Los Angeles. She was found wandering the streets in her hospital gown and slippers. The genius of Reagan and his handlers was that these visions were never enunciated in such dystopian terms. In Reagan's speeches, the plan for corporate hegemony was always hidden behind paeans to the good old-fashioned inventiveness and entrepreneurial instincts of Americans, as if we were still a nation of artisans and small-scale capitalists, not the epicenter of a global oligopoly where corporations have no real allegiance to any single country. Cyril Seward, the chief financial officer at the Colgate-Palmolive Company, summed up the Reagan era in 1989 when he described his company's lack of devotion to the country that was showering it with tax breaks. Quote, "The United States does not have an automatic call on our resources. There is no mindset that puts this country first." I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody. There's a lot more to this book. It covers a wide range of sectors of the United States, but I think that gives an idea of the direction I've taken it in.
You've been listening to journalist and author William Kleinknecht talking about his latest book, The Man Who Sold the World, Ronald Reagan and the Betrayal of Main Street America. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer segment from the presentation. William Kleinknecht is a longtime journalist who has written for the New York Daily News and other newspapers in the region. He is also author of New Ethnic Mobs, The Changing Face of Organized Crime in America. He spoke at Powell's City of Books in Portland, Oregon on February 11, 2009. And now we return to the question and answer segment from the presentation. The first question for the author was how much Rupert Murdoch, who was a personal friend of Ronald Reagan, influenced the positive portrayal of Reagan in the media.
Well, I think he probably has an enormous image. I mean, you just look at Fox News and read the New York Post, and you can see that you never see criticism of Ronald Reagan there. Of course, you never see it on, yeah. other networks either. So he certainly has had an influence, but he hasn't been alone. Yes?
The next audience member asked how former President Bill Clinton could have let this happen.
Well, Bill Clinton, as far as I'm concerned, in many respects, continued the Reagan mandate. There was more deregulation under Bill Clinton than there was under Ronald Reagan. And Bill Clinton also presided over the elimination of welfare as a federal entitlement. Bill Clinton expanded the use of the death penalty on the federal level. His administration was filled with people who were products of Wall Street and contributed mightily to the problems that we have now. And a lot of those same people were advisors to Barack Obama, and they're still skulking around, which is kind of concerns me. But yeah, so I don't. How could Bill Clinton allow this to happen? I think Bill Clinton was, in a large degree, just a continuation of Reaganism.
The audience member then asked if these points were covered in the prologue of the book.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Sure. Yep. Yes.
The next audience member asked about how the British have evaluated Margaret Thatcher. Have they been somewhat more critical of Thatcher than have the U.S. media been of Reagan?
You know, I didn't research that too much. I mean, obviously, Tony Blair was a lot like Bill Clinton with his triangulation and was very supportive of free market approach to governance, but I really don't know exactly how the Brits have rated him.
That they've been somewhat more critical, but that's...
I would not be surprised.
You make a lot of fun of it.
Yes.
The next member of the audience asked the author if it was a necessity or merely an advantage to be a crime reporter writing about the Reagan years.
I'm actually not even sure why they describe me as a crime reporter, because I've done all kinds of reporting. In recent years, I was covering a courthouse. So, but you know, my last book was about organized crime, and I think this book I've sort of focused on a much larger and more important level of criminality. Yes.
The next member of the audience, who identified herself as a Clinton defender, argued that Clinton was not on the scene in the 1980s. She said that there was widespread homelessness at the time due to the Reagan policies. She asked the author about the case of the Air Traffic Controllers Union early in the Reagan administration, when the striking air traffic controllers were fired and the union was broken. What were the consequences of that early action by the Reagan administration? She also asked about the event of the 241 U.S. soldiers killed in the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon in 1983. This member of the audience suggested that Reagan did not take any action in response to the bombing. She asked if the author deals with these events in his book.
I don't, because I should have mentioned at the beginning, the book focuses almost entirely on domestic policy and his domestic legacy. But in answer to your question about the firing of the air traffic controllers, I think that had a huge impact. I mean, it wasn't that it was a legal precedent of any enormity, because clearly the law said that those employees were not allowed to strike, and he had the right to fire them. But no president in the previous decades ever would have taken that step, and I think it sent a huge message to employers around the country that it was morally okay to break the unions or fire strikers, and at the same time the Reagan administration abandoned enforcement of national labor law, and I don't think that enforcement has ever recovered, and that's part of the reason that we've seen the number of organized people organized by labor unions plummet the past 20, 30 years. So I think it had a huge impact. Yes.
The next member of the audience observed that Reagan was not a deep thinker or an intellectual. He suggested that Reagan was really playing a role of spokesman. If Reagan didn't come up with the policies he sold to the American people, who did come up with these policies? Who was the power behind the Reagan administration?
Well, he was created by a group of businessmen Southern California, who were known as the kitchen cabinet. And
Does that include Leon Hayes?
who?
Leon Hayes, yeah.
Yeah.
Leon Hayes.
Leon Ames? I don't know. Maybe. Okay. Okay. But they were also referred to in the press in California at the time as the millionaire backers, and they recognized how effectively Ronald Reagan had been selling General Electric products and even giving speeches for General Electric around the country, in which he was already talking about the handful of issues that would later define his presidency. So they created him and propelled him into public life. I think by the time he ran for president, he had a very, I think, he was not an unintelligent man. I mean, he had a photographic memory, and he had ability to remember things, and he was a gifted speaker. But when it comes to policies, I think he had a few core values that he cared about. He believed in reducing government. He believed in cutting taxes. He believed in empowering police, and he believed in a strong military. But I don't think his thinking went, the complexity of his thinking went much beyond that. I think what really propagated the Reagan Revolution was the various elements in his administration who all pursued separate agendas very effectively. You had Ed Meese, who was he was the architect of much of his criminal justice policies and the war on drugs, along with William French Smith. And you had Ronald Reagan, who early in 1981 appeared before a Senate Banking Committee and laid out a blueprint for the near complete deregulation of the financial sector, and that blueprint, it wasn't all completed during the Reagan years. Some of it was completed during the Clinton years, including the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. So in all different areas of the Reagan administration, you had these people pursuing agendas and enacting policies that were very complex. And I don't think Ronald Reagan ever had a complete understanding of all that was taking place in his administration and what the implications would be. But it was all under the rubric of what he stood for and what he so powerfully sold the American people on. So I don't think it absolves him of blame, but it's more complex than just Ronald Reagan embodied this entire vision.
The next member of the audience referred to the radio talk show host Rachel Maddow, saying that she had been discussing the Reagan legacy in terms very similar to the way the author had been discussing them in his book. Does the author think that the political climate is shifting with the appearance of his book and others, or does he consider himself a lonely voice in the wilderness?
No, I think it is shifting clearly. It's got a long way to go. Reaganism still has, the terms of the way we live in this country, I think, are still defined by Reaganism, and you'll never put some of these things back in the bottle. But I think it is shifting. I think much of what we're looking at now in terms of this stimulus package, and Barack Obama standing up saying he's going to re-regulate the financial sector and he's going to plow money into education and infrastructure. And I think all that is a repudiation of Reaganism. I think the question is whether it's something that they're going to do in the short term as a stimulus package and then go back to business as usual and return to making deficit cutting their main strategy. But I also think if you look at for instance, the 1960s, the liberalism was fairly moderate at the beginning of the 1960s, and then as a result of the Vietnam War and other things, it gathered strength. I think anytime there's a swinging of the pendulum, it starts gradually and then often accelerates. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a continual move leftward in this country. Could be wrong. There's a lot of things that are different in this country than were in the past. There's a lot less. Well, there's probably another year or two, there can be very few newspapers, so I don't know where people are going to get the information they need to form a critical opinion of what's going on in this country. But what's that?
Talk shows.
Talk shows, exactly. But yeah, so I think the tide is turning. Yeah. Yes.
Did you say in
Yes, in fact, I chose it. It's from a Chesterfield ad that Reagan.
I saw that in an antique store.
Yeah.
Before I saw your book.
It's great. I was hoping that they could put the whole ad on, but it was too busy, so they just took a part of it. But if you ever go on the internet and put in Reagan and Chesterfield ad, it's really a hilarious ad. He's got a stack of Chesterfield cartons in front of him, and he's signing them. He's got one hanging out of his mouth, and
Signing them, huh?
yeah. I think you had a question. Yeah.
The next member of the audience observed that there seems to be a kind of sports mentality when it comes to political views in this country, that most people don't really think through their political opinions. They just adopt a particular view without much reflection. He suggested that Reagan also seemed to have this approach to his politics. He had very shallow views, and so he could easily be led one way or the other. And all he really contributed was his acting skills in selling these policies as a spokesperson for a particular set of interests, putting out a message that he had very little influence in crafting.
Well, I think that's true, and part of the evidence of that is he started out as a liberal, extremely liberal person. He was very pro New Deal. New Deal bailed out his family. The New Deal bailed out his family during the 30s when his father was out of work. And when he first went to Hollywood, he was a left-winger. He would speak at events for fairly left-wing groups. And but then in a space of about 18 months, for various reasons, he went from being a dyed-in-the-wool liberal to an informant for the FBI, spying on communist groups in Hollywood. And right, yeah. Now I understand. What I don't understand. He could, if he grew disenchanted with the extremism of communists in Hollywood, well, maybe that was a legitimate stance to take, but at the same time, he completely abandoned any identification with working people, even though he was the head of the Screen Actors Guild, so he just did a complete about-face. So
This member of the audience followed up, returning to the sports metaphor, arguing that it was really a kind of blind loyalty, like backing a particular sports team. It has nothing to do with any particular ideology or politics, but more to do with belonging, rather than a view that is carefully thought through.
Yeah, I think so, and I think he was also influenced by, he was espousing the values of people who could benefit him. At the Screen Actors Guild, he was doing the bidding of MCA rather than the members of the Music Corporation of America, rather than the members of the Screen Actors Guild. And he started hanging around with wealthy businessmen, and he just absorbed their values. So he has this reputation of a person who has extremely core values that he never wavers from, but he actually wavered from them rather dramatically.
The next member of the audience asked about this transition, saying that he was not able to find much writing about it, and he asked if it was taken up by the author in his book.
Yes, it's in the book. If you want to go further than what's in my book, if you read Reagan's America by Gary Wills, he talks about it a lot. Yeah. Yes.
The next member of the audience asked whether the author had come across the book by Gary Moldea, Dark Victory, Reagan, MCA, and the Mob.
I did, yeah. I didn't read it, but I'm aware of it. Gary Moldea, I think, is the author. Yes.
The next member of the audience suggested that it was problematic to judge the Reagan administration because his mental problems were becoming more significant.
Yeah, it is. It seems to me that they were present at least halfway through his presidency, if not through his governorship.
It started in California.
Right, yeah. Oh, yes.
The next member of the audience observed that the key resonating theme of Reagan's 1980 campaign was to balance the federal budget. And yet in the first year of his two administrations, they doubled the budget deficit, and it exploded further through the remainder of his presidency. Do you deal with the issue of the budget deficits through the Reagan years, and the contrast with his rhetoric about balancing the budget?
Well, I think there's two reasons behind it. One is the Laffer curve, the supply-side economics told us that if they cut taxes dramatically, it would produce so much economic activity that tax revenues would increase and we would end up with a surplus. Well, that obviously failed to happen. Even Arthur Laffer now admits that it was a big failure. But I think the other thing that has been kind of overlooked is I think that a lot of people around Ronald Reagan were perfectly happy to drive up these huge budget deficits because it meant that the next few generations of leaders would have almost no ability to embark on serious public investment. And that's exactly what happened with Bill Clinton. Because of Graham Rudman, his whole presidency was about deficit reduction, and he initiated no new social programs, and we really haven't initiated any new social programs since then, anything meaningful.
This member of the audience followed up, asking if the failure of the media to confront this issue goes back 3 decades. Was it a failure of the media, or was it a matter of U.S. citizens just not being interested, not paying attention?
Well, I think that the irony of him being a advocate of smaller government and ending up with these huge deficits, I think that is something that got a fair amount of press. You know, there were a few things that the press harped on, and at the same time they were ignoring things that were maybe just as meaningful. But I think that did get a fair amount of press. But you know, after they said it a few times, you know, right, exactly. Yes.
The next member of the audience asked about Reagan's tenure as governor of California. California used to have a great education system, a great college and university system. There were progressive policies in place in California, and all that seemed to change under Reagan. In your book, do you talk about how Reagan changed policies at the state government level as well?
No, I don't. I discuss his governorship somewhat briefly because I wanted the book to focus more on his legacy in the post-Reagan era. There have been some good books. You know, if you read Lou Cannon's biography of Reagan, he has a book specifically called Governor Reagan, and that'd be a good resource if you're interested in that. Anyone else? Yes.
The next member of the audience asked about the fiction, the notion that there's a strong link between the common man and the stock market, the idea that everybody has a share in the stock market, in Wall Street finance. Do you talk about this idea of the ownership society in your book, and how that was projected by the Republicans to sell their policies?
Well, there's a part in the book where I quote some pretty good statistics that were published by the Economic Policy Institute that shows that the middle income and certainly lower income people, that their wealth during these stock market booms did not appreciate to much degree at all. That the gains in the stock market, you know, there was this fiction put forth that all sorts of regular people around the country made all this money in the stock market, and they really didn't. It was the institutional investors and wealthy people, and those statistics are in the book, and I think you're right. I think it's kind of a fiction. Yes?
The next member of the audience observed that we have retirement plans, 401ks, savings, all these ways of putting money aside, but then we lose it all. They fatten us up, and then they take it all. They're farming. That's what they're doing.
And now we've all lost it anyway.
So many years.
Yeah. Yes.
The next question from the audience was whether the author received any threats regarding his work.
No.
Good.
But it's still early. I'm more concerned about getting threats of this book than I did when I wrote the organized crime book, actually. The
next member of the audience asked if the author wrote about Reagan's belief that he served in the Second World War, a belief that seems to have come from his participation in films about the war.
I think I mentioned the one instance in which he told Yitzhak Shamir, the head of Israel, that he had been in the death camps during World War II, when actually he was in a fake death camp on a studio lot. You know, people say, well, he must have been muddled in his thinking then, but I refuse to believe that anybody could mistake the fact that they were in the United States and claim that they were in Europe. I mean, to me, that's just a lie. You know,
I've known a person like
right. Yes.
The next member of the audience observed that the author had commented in interviews that Reagan didn't have any friends. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, To me, one of the things that's very fascinating is that Reagan is the child of a fairly serious alcoholic. And if you look at the research that has been done into adult children of alcoholics, and I don't mean, I mean severe alcoholics where a child has real insecurity in their life, one of the very common syndromes is that they have a very hard time letting people in and being close to people, because they have a certain amount, they're used to hiding shame and hiding themselves and things like that. And whether or not that's the reason, for some reason Reagan, by the end of his life, and for a good part of his adult life, had no real close friends who he had always stayed in touch with, no communities that he really mattered to him and that he stayed in touch with, including his hometown of Dixon, Illinois. Even some of the California businessmen who got him started in politics found that they lost entree to him when he got to the White House. At one point during his 1980 campaign, when he wanted John Sears to be his campaign manager, he was ready and actually did fire a bunch of the people who had been with him since his California days. He even fired Michael Deaver. And then finally they had a falling out with John Sears, and Ed Meese convinced him to dump Sears, and they ended up bringing some of those people back, including Lynn Nofsinger and Michael Deaver, but he had just showed no loyalty to them. He never showed any loyalty to really any people. His aides in the White House would always comment on the fact that he never really pulled them aside and told them they were doing a good job. He was very good at, he was terrible at small talk. He could only talk about very issues in the abstract. And even Nancy in her memoirs has said at times she felt that she didn't really know him. So it's a very curious phenomenon, and I think it probably has something to do with his father.
This member of the audience followed up, observing that Reagan had no friends in the White House other than his wife, Nancy.
Right. In fact, in his second term, one of the complaints that Nancy had was that by then he was completely surrounded by strangers. Meese was gone, or he was Attorney General, and Deaver, I think, left. He'd become an alcoholic and left, and he was surrounded by people he really didn't know. Right.
The next question from the audience was whether it was fair to say that Reagan consulted astrologers. His wife, Nancy Reagan, did, but did Reagan himself?
She did, but he listened to her. Yeah. Anybody else?
The next question for the author was what role Nancy Reagan played in the White House. Was it a significant role?
I think she played a big role. I don't know if it's ever come out how much of a role she played, because a lot of it was probably done behind the scenes. Ronald Reagan has talked a lot about her influence on him, but that's actually something I would like to know more about myself. Yeah.
The next member of the audience asked if the author thought that Reagan understood the significance of his decisions and policies for ordinary people here in the United States and abroad. Did he understand the consequences for ordinary people?
I don't think he fully did. So sometimes they would, he would hear about an instance of a person who was suffering, an individual, and he would be affected by it. He wasn't able to connect it to his policies, and I think a lot of the things that were happening in his administration, he wasn't even making the real decisions. One thing that struck me is when Caspar Weinberger wanted him to side with him on increasing defense expenditures, he would come into the Oval Office in meetings and he would have cartoon figures of soldiers to sort of dramatize to Reagan what was needed. I mean, he couldn't just talk to him about numbers. He had to show him pictures. And Ed Meese was a genius. Ed Meese had a lot of influence on Reagan because he was very good at portraying things to him in ways that he knew Reagan could understand through anecdotes and things like that, instead of numbers and policy prescriptions. So that's how I would answer that. One more question? Okay, one more question. Yes?
The next member of the audience mentioned a book by Peggy Noonan about the Reagan presidency. An example she gave involved an aide approaching Reagan about a rather complicated plan, and this aide was trying to explain it to Reagan. Reagan only wanted to know the basics of the plan, and on that superficial understanding he was willing to sign off on these kinds of decisions.
Yeah, it was often, you folks work it out. Right. Mm-hmm. One of her books was called When Character Was King. Okay, I guess we're all set here.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to journalist and author William Kleinknecht talking about his latest book, The Man Who Sold the World, Ronald Reagan and the Betrayal of Main Street America. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions. To find out more about our work and to access our growing library of free on-demand streaming audio and video programs, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. And please write to us with your comments and questions at pdxjustice@riseup.net. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.
Not help but have a profound impact on public opinion. It explains how a 2001 poll by the Gallup organization could find that Americans rate Reagan as the most popular former president, ahead of Kennedy, Lincoln, and Washington. His name adorns public landmarks across the country: the former Washington National Airport, any number of freeways, a medical center in Los Angeles, a Navy aircraft carrier, countless schools and office buildings, and a peak in New Hampshire's famous presidential mountain range. A group called the Ronald Reagan Legacy Project has a goal of pinning his name to a landmark in every one of the nation's 3,067 counties, including a monument to rival the Lincoln Memorial on the Mall in Washington. The apotheosis of Ronald Reagan was never more abject than in the coverage of his funeral. In death, as in the last years of his life, Reagan was revered in the media as a great patriot whose love of country and undying faith in American exceptionalism, the shining city on a hill, were his defining traits. He was lionized for his instinctive identification with the common man and for espousing the traditional values that had once been the backbone of the nation. He was hailed for an infectious optimism that restored the nation's faith in itself and put us on a path to the two longest spurts of economic growth in American history. The scant criticism of his domestic policies, almost none of it found in the electronic media, followed the same well-worn threads. His tax cuts and military buildup led to huge budget deficits. His administration was rife with ethical violations. His cuts in social welfare programs were seen by some as mean-spirited. The script could not have been more adoring if it was written by Nancy Reagan herself, but it was also stunning in its myopia. For Ronald Reagan, glad to take any questions from anyone. This first passage is from the introduction of the book, which lays out a pretty good overview of what the book is about. This book is, I guess I should put my glasses on, that would help a little. This book is born of annoyance, a great bewilderment over the myth that continues to surround the presidency of Ronald Reagan. It gives voice to a vast swath of psychically disenfranchised Americans, millions of them, lumped most thickly in the urban areas on either coast, who never understood Reagan's appeal. For more than 2 decades, they have stood by puzzled as this Hollywood actor and shill for General Electric, this obvious enemy of the common people he claimed to represent, this empty suit who believed in flying saucers and allowed an astrologer to guide his presidential scheduling, held sway over the American imagination. Evidence is amassing to support their view. The bitter legacy of Reaganism, the subprime mortgage scandal, the near collapse of the financial system, widening income inequality, the emergence of lockdown America, the obscene inflation of CEO compensation, the end of locally owned media, market crashes, blackouts, drug company scandals, rampant greed and materialism is all around us. As D.H. Lawrence once wrote in another context, the cataclysm has happened. We are among the ruins. But the controversy that once surrounded Reagan seems to have been banished from our public discourse. It is not that there is no public indignation over the state of our democracy. Reagan, when the layers of myth are peeled away, was arguably the least patriotic president in American history. He laid the foundation for a new global economic order in which nationhood would gradually become meaningless. He enacted policies that helped wipe out the high-paying jobs for the working class that were the real backbone of the country. This supposed guardian of traditional values was the architect of wrenching social change that swept across the country in the 1980s, the emergence of an eerie, over-commercialized, postmodern America that has left so much of the population, the populace psychically adrift. Reagan propelled the transition to hyper-capitalism, an epoch in which the forces of self-interest and profit seek to make a final rout of traditional human values. His legacy, mergers, deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, privatization, globalization, helped weaken the family and eradicate small-town life and the sense of community. Not only the inner-city poor, but working-class and middle-class Americans in small towns across the country were the losers in the post-Reagan era. Because of deregulation, trucking concerns, bus companies, and airlines have eliminated much of their service to small rural communities, leaving them isolated and economically depressed in a society ever dominated by the great population centers on either coast. Because of corporate consolidation, businesses are no longer owned locally and Main Street is gone. Companies made over many times by mergers and forced to tailor every decision to stock market prices have little loyalty to communities or people. Commerce becomes alien, unreliable, globalized. Plants are closed and companies are downsized, families uprooted, and are in wide agreement that the country has gone horribly off course, that Washington is now bought and paid for by corporations and is making little effort to solve the nation's most vexing problems. The great conundrum is this: none of these unmistakable harbingers of American decline is being laid where it belongs, at the door of Ronald Reagan. In the 2 decades that have passed since Reagan left office, no non-academic book has appeared making the case that his policies were destructive for America, even though that view is commonly held among members of the left liberal intelligentsia. We have just finished a presidential campaign season marked by an unseemly competition among Republican aspirants to wrap themselves in the Reagan mantle. Quote, "I am a conservative Republican and I will remain so in the school of Ronald Reagan," proclaimed John McCain. Quote, "I took the same exact path Ronald Reagan took," insisted Mike Huckabee. In a Time magazine cover story headlined, "What Would Ronnie Do?" and Why the Republican Candidates Need to Reclaim the Reagan Legacy, political correspondent Karen Tumulty wrote admiringly that the former president, quote, "embodied the idea that progress comes from going up against the status quo." The disconnect between the Reagan of myth and the Reagan of reality has been palpable in the media for years. Rarely in the history of the democratic world has a press corps been so blind to a leader's faults, so gullible in the face of a concerted effort by a small band of zealots to burnish an otherwise lusterless image. The so-called liberal media failed to utter a peep of protest in 2003 when Esquire magazine named Reagan the greatest living American. This abjuring of all standards of even-handedness by the media could not Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. This is actually the best turnout I've had in all the places I've gone so far. It's nice to see that this is one place where the myth surrounding Ronald Reagan has not caught on so heavily. This is Portland. I think, you know, a lot of people around the country I've talked to, even people who are progressive, that they have a sort of a sense that Ronald Reagan is someone that they didn't really care for, but they don't have a good sense of the degree to which his legacy and his policies have had such a major impact on the country. There's been Gallup polls that have shown that Ronald Reagan is the most popular former president, which is really kind of astounding. More popular than Lincoln or Washington or Kennedy, and I think a big part of the reason is because the media and the publishing industry has done a terrible job at informing people about the implications of Reagan's policies. And that's kind of what I've tried to do in this book, to strip away a little bit of that myth. I'm I'm going to read a couple passages from the book, and after that, I'd be